Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Every now and again, I notice that one of my slightly out-of-date guides gets a lot of traffic over on YouTube. And as a result, I tend to then have a bit of a look into it and say, is it needed to make a new version, or does the old one still hold up? Well, today I wanted to take a look at scrying maps in 3.26 because whilst a lot of the stuff that I talked about in 3.25 still applies, I do think there have been some changes to the conclusions that you draw. So, a quick recap. What is scrying maps? How does it work? So here's an atlas that has exactly one not very impactful scry set up on it. This is a scry from Arid Lake to Bog map. What this does is it changes the loot tables of Bog map specifically. All of the divination cards that would normally be found in Bog map are no longer present, and all of the divination cards that would normally be found in Arid Lake are instead present. If you wanted to set up this exact scry, and I'm not really recommending it, this was just me messing around a little bit, but if you did want to set this up, the way you would do it is by running the Arid Lake in tier 16 until you're able to encounter the Nameless Seer there. The Nameless Seer is an RNG encounter, but you can make it more common, at least it's speculated, through the use of adding more native monster packs to the map. And probably the best way to do that is through the use of shrines. So if you've got a shrine atlas and shrine scarabs, that does seem to make the Nameless Seer appear more, although I don't think that's actually proven. So the native divination cards found in Arid Lake are the Rabid Rower, Bitter Blossom, Offspring, and Eye of the Dragon. The native divination cards that would be found in Bog are different, but because this scry exists, they are overwritten by what would be natively on Arid Lake. Again, Eye of the Dragon, Offspring, Bitter Blossom, and Rabid Rower. So there's a couple of things that need to be answered. Firstly, what are the best maps that you can imprint from? For example, here I've imprinted from Arid Lake onto Bog, but imprinting from Arid Lake is not really particularly good. There are much better choices out there, and we'll go through some of those in a sec. The second thing you want to be thinking of is what are the best maps to imprint onto? And here, I think there is actually a fairly clear answer that you should at least seriously consider. And that is that if you pay attention, you'll see that Toxic Sewer is adjacent to Beach map. What this means is that if you set up your atlas to be favorited roughly 50-50 between Toxic Sewer and Beach map, then you'll mostly get Toxic Sewers when you're running Beach, you'll mostly get Beaches when you're running Toxic Sewer, and if you're running anything else, you'll mostly get Toxic Sewers and Beaches. Both of these are pretty good tile sets, and as a result, they're pretty good to imprint onto. That said, they're not the only choices. You can definitely find other combinations that work well, and you might want to also consider what the tier 17 map drops are at the moment. Ziggurat is the one that comes out of the Toxic Sewer, and Abomination comes out of Beach. Scrying does not impact those. So let's have some quick discussion as to the best categories of maps to imprint from. The first thing we need to say is that divination cards don't make up as much of the loot you find on a map as they have in some previous incarnations of the game. So if you played back in 3.17 through to 3.23, you will remember that divination cards were a fair chunk of the amount of loot that you got in most of those leagues. Then in 3.24, they just exploded, at least with some top-end juicing strategies. 3.25, 3.26 actually matters a bit less than it has in the past. That said, scrying can still be very strong. And I'm going to quickly go through the best categories of divination card rewards to look for. Now, I do want to point out here that I am primarily putting this video out from a trade league perspective, but I do want to talk quickly about some SSF considerations. If you're playing in trade league, there's a number of really good unique items that exist in the game that end up not being worth all that much just because whilst they do something intrinsically very powerful, ultimately players get them and then don't need another. A good example of this is Beric's Respite. Now this ring has a divination card that drops in Plateau map, called the Spark and the Flame. Beric's Respite is a tier 3 rarity unique ring, and it's very good on its own as an item on Ignite based builds, but it's also one of the 3 vendor recipe pieces that go together to make the Taming, which is often maybe not quite best in slot, but pretty close to best in slot on a lot of elemental damage builds. Well, the Spark and the Flame is fantastic loot on day 1 of a league, because there's a huge amount of demand for it. But what tends to happen is that between Beric's Respites that people want to equip and Tamings that people want to equip, there might be demand for 60 or 70,000 of them across the league. But then you hit a point where all those 60 or 70,000 already exist. And from then on, the Spark and the Flame kind of isn't really loot anymore. However, If you play in solo self-found, and the Spark and the Flame drops and you're playing either some sort of Ignite-based Chieftain build that really wants Beric's Respite to wear, or you're playing some sort of Warden build that really wants the Taming to wear, then getting the Spark and the Flame is exciting, even if it's much later in the league than it would be in Trade League. So, if you are playing in solo self-found, while the conclusions that we're going to draw are influenced heavily by Trade League considerations, actually you can come up with your own conclusions based upon the methodology that we go through that's more Trade League centered, but that is tailored to your requirements in solo self-found, which will be different to those of someone that's playing over in Trade, who's much more concerned with things that remain scarce all league, whether that be Mage Bloods, whether that be Mirrors, whether it be Original Sin Relics. At the time I'm recording this video, once you factor in the rarity of Divination cards and the loot that they provide, the best Divination card to farm is the Apothecary, and this can only be found in Defiled Cathedral at the moment. And whilst this was not historically the case, in the past Crimson Township did drop the Apothecary, that is not the case now, and it is simply Defiled Cathedral. That is the one place that you're able to get the Mage Blood card, the Apothecary. Now there are two other Divination cards that aren't farmable that provide Mage Blood as well. The Insane Cat, which drops from Kosis, and there's also the Price of Devotion, which comes from Uberatsri. Neither of those are farmable, neither of them are tied to a tile set, and as a result, they're not particularly great choices. Why do I say that this is the best and not one of the more valuable Divination cards, or maybe something that's more common than the Apothecary? That's because we actually know quite a lot about the relative drop rates of Divination cards. If you go to Faustus and you request a Divination card, even if you can't afford that Divination card, Faustus will provide you a gold cost that he'll charge in order to provide that from a trade counterparty. Now, when you do this, it will actually give you a lot of information as to how rare that Divination card is. So you'll see here, we search for the Apothecary, the gold cost is 1,100. Let's look for something else, shall we? Here, we'll go and have a look at what the Nurse is, and it's 450. This intuitively might make you think, oh, it's something like 2.5 times as common as the Apothecary, but actually there's a slightly more complex formula than that, and the gap in rarity between the Nurse and the Apothecary is much wider than that. That said, I did a video on it in the past when this was discovered. I'll put a link to that down in the description below. The conclusion we came to in that was that the drop rate of cards that have a Faustus gold cost exceeding 125 is inversely proportional to the cube of the gold cost. So if you double the gold cost, you are reducing the drop rate by a factor of 8. If the gold cost goes up by a factor of 10, then the rarity of the card goes up by a factor of 1,000, or its drop rate goes down by a factor of 1,000. So with that in mind, with a speculated drop rate of 9, the Apothecary does end up coming out on top at its current value. But this isn't likely to hold forever, and if the value of the Apothecary falls under 28 Divines at any point in the future, then at that point, a new category of card will replace it in the top spot. That is, all of the Divination cards that award Divine Orbs directly. So we have the Sephiroth with a believed drop rate of 330. Again, all that information is in the video on how we worked out the drop rates of all the Divination cards from Faustus. Or you have Brother's Gift with a drop rate that's believed to be 60. Or many players' favourite, the Fortunate, with a drop rate that's believed to be 1,800. So the Fortunate's drop rate appears to be 200 times that of the Apothecary. So for every one Apothecary you get, you would receive 200 copies of the Fortunate on average. The other thing, though, that makes the Fortunate quite nice to farm is that because its drop rate is not terrible, you will actually self-compile sets of them in a reasonable period of time, and so that ends up being something that's a reasonably popular option to do there. However, these are not the only Divination cards that you can consider farming. The next one I want to mention is one that isn't there yet, but that might become a good choice in the future. However, this cannot interact with the scrying system at all because its drop location is Shaper Guardian Maps. This is the Divination card Father's Love. A set of 2 of this card, which is very rare with a drop rate speculated to be 5, i.e. quite a bit rarer than that for the Apothecary, set of 2 of these turns in for Sublime Vision, one of the rarest drops from the Uber Shaper. This jewel has something like 15 or 20 different versions, and one of them, Purity of Fire, tends to be extremely chase. Sometimes, although not in every league, this version of the jewel can end up being worth multiple mirrors, and when that happens, there will be people who buy up copies of Sublime Vision, hoping to get that particular version of the jewel. All the different versions of the jewel seem to be equal in rarity, but there is a huge gulf in how popular they are, and that ends up really showing through when it comes to the value of the items. However, there are some things that tend to go up a lot in value as a league gets older, and there are 2 divination cards that you can farm that award mirror shards. So, there is Unrequited Love. Unrequited Love drops in the Vile Pyramid map, and this is an extremely rare card. It's believed to have a drop rate of only 4, so twice as rare and more as the Apothecary, but a set of 16 of this card will award 19 mirror shards. This is basically a trade league only thing because in solo self-found, self-compiling a set of Unrequited Love is a monumental undertaking. However, there tends to come a point in trade league where a bunch of people hit the point where they're like, you know what, I finished all my main goals. There's a couple of things that I'm not willing to grind towards, but that I might stick around if I was able to get. And for that purpose, those players will buy copies of Unrequited Love because it's often the most expensive divination card in the game by late in the league. And they will use the Harvest Double or Nothing gamble. If they end up with a full set, then they'll go and mirror an item and they'll do more stuff in the league. And if they end up down to 0, then they'll walk away until the next league. Well, demand from these types of players can sometimes push Unrequited Love to be worth more than the 1.2 mirror shards per card that it looks like it should be worth if you just consider what it actually awards. So it turns out that turning in a set of Unrequited Love ends up losing your currency, and what you would do if you had 16 of them is actually go and sell them to people that are looking to take out this sort of end-of-league gamble themselves. It is the other mirror shard card that's going to end up being the one I'm going to recommend today. Not necessarily because 7 Years Bad Luck is better or worse than Unrequited Love. It's quite a bit worse at the moment to farm than the Divine Orb cards we discussed earlier. It's because of what else is on this map. And this is Basillica Map. So Basillica Map has 7 Years Bad Luck. This is a genuinely good card. It's a step down from the Divine Orb cards. It's a step down from the Apothecary. But have a look at those other cards that are present. We have Damnation. This is a new divination card. It awards the original scripture, which is the relic that's required to attempt an original sin no-hit sanctum run. Now, the original scripture is something that Grinding Gear Games consider to be more special than a Mage Blood. What this means is that Damnation is rarer than the Apothecary, with a drop rate of 5 compared to the Apothecary's 9, and on top of that, it has a set size of 16 compared to 5 for the Apothecary. However, the original scripture and original sin tend to be the most expensive item in a mature trade league. As a result, there's a reasonable chance that this divination card will go up over time as well, like the Mirror Shard card is likely to do as people start mirroring more and more items. On top of that, the other 2 divination cards present here are not trash. The Enlightened is pretty rare, as is Demigod's Wager for that matter. Demigod's Wager, annulment orbs are useful. They're not worth very much in trade leagues, certainly not commensurate to how rare they are. Orbs of Annulment seem to be 2.5 times as rare as Divine Orbs, and they end up not even being worth an appreciable fraction of a Divine Orb, much less something that's worth more than it to compensate for being rarer. But that said, they are still something that in-game players probably use quite a few of, and so it's a divination card you don't mind having. It might save you a couple of trades later on if you're able to just drop 14 of these while you're farming something else. But it's the Enlightened that's the other real bonus here as well. A level 3 Enlighten is not as good as a level 4 Enlighten for obvious reasons, but the Divination card is quite a bit more common than the Divination cards that award a level 4 Enlighten. So with all of that in mind, I think that Basillica probably ends up as the best choice of a donor map. Then your second choice comes down to one critical question. Do you want to have a massive jackpot that you're probably not going to see very often? In that case, you want the Apothecary, and that means Crimson Temple is your other donor map. The other choice, though, is just simply to have a Divine Orb. And if you're going to chase a Divine Orb map, then you may as well pick something that's got another good card on it as well. And for that reason, I'm going to recommend Ivory Temple. Ivory Temple has the quite rare IC Brothers, which is essentially 1-for-1 for a Fracturing Orb when you get it. Now, this Divination card is rare, and it seems to have a drop rate of 27, according to what we've been able to pick up from Faustus. So that means that Grinding Gear Games consider a Fracturing Orb to be something like 11 times as special as a Divine Orb. That said, you've got the Sephiroth, which is fantastic. You've got IC Brothers, which is meaningfully worse than the Sephiroth, but that is still a pretty good card. This is my pick for the next best choice for a donor map that you can use. The other thing that's worth keeping in mind is that all of these potential donor maps are basically divination cards that are likely to hold some value over the entirety of the league. So what about the other divination cards that are high in price on this list? House of Mirrors comes from an unscryable location, that's from the Alluring Abyss. The Apothecary we've discussed, Unrequited Love we've discussed, Damnation we've discussed, Price of Devotion also unscryable, that's also Alluring Abyss. Father's Love, unscryable, that's the Shaper Guardian maps. Insane Cat, unscryable, that's Kosis. History. History, we have not yet pinned down the location of this Divination card. It's something that does not come from a scryable location. Fire of Unknown Origin was something that was worth considering scrying in the past, but that was when this Divination card was 25 to 30 divines. With it being around 8 divines at the moment, I don't think it's worth scrying for because it is pretty rare, and it's basically the same as going to be said when we come to the Doctor. Both of these seem to have a drop rate of 16. The Immortal comes from Hall of Grandmasters, so it's not scryable. The Demon is just far too rare. We speculate that this has a drop rate of 2, and so don't bother with it. Brother's Gift has already been mentioned as a Divine Orb card. Then we've had the Doctor, too rare for what it gives you. Brother's Gift is worth more than it, and Brother's Gift is something like 4 times as common. I See Brothers we've discussed as a good choice because you can get it as a bonus. It wouldn't pull you into Ivory Temple on its own, but when you're already getting Ivory Temple for the Sephiroth, then having I See Brothers there is great. And then Divine Justice, Greatest Intentions, The Fiend, The Cheater, Choking Guilt, Endless Darkness, Progeny of Lunaris. Some of these do come from scryable locations like Progeny of Lunaris, but they're just a bit too rare for the price that they trade for at the moment. And that's going to be the case as you go further down this list of current prices for Divination cards. Anyways, that's my thoughts on scrying in patch 3.26. Probably the best donor maps in the game are Basillica, Defiled Cathedral, and Ivory Temple, and the best scrying location to go onto is Toxic Sewer and Beach for most players, but your Atlas may cause that to change. But most importantly, scrying is simply a bit less important than it's been in the past because Divination cards make up less of the value of the loot than you got back when Divination Scarabs were particularly broken. I'm going to leave it there. May your Val Orbs have interesting results.